2?
17A3.
Thank you.
קורא את המגילה למפרע.
17A3 in the art scroll. Thank you, Robert. Okay. We're going to start now. Person who reads the Megillah backwards. Now, what does it mean to read it backwards? So it has a number of options. One could be you read the words backwards. In other words, you start from the last word and you go to the first word. However, it also means if you read verses not in order, you put the second verse before the first verse, and it could also mean the paragraphs, that you do this paragraph or chapter before the next one. And basically, the understanding is that all of those is lo yatsa, you are not yotze. And the fact that if you read words backwards, you're not yotze, you do not fulfill the obligation of reading the Megillah, that would seem to be obvious. Because if you read the words backwards, you will not have any understanding of the story, because the words being read backwards basically will ruin the entire meaning of the verse. It'll have no meaning. It will basically be mumble jumble. It'll be just words that have no intent. But however, if you read paragraphs backwards, what would be so wrong with that? You got the whole story here. So you got that story before this story. Why is that not okay? So the understanding is that the Megillah has to be, it's all about keeping you in suspense, in seeing the hand of Hashem. And so if you read it backwards, you lose that hand of Hashem throughout the entire story. If you read it from the beginning to the end, you see how Hashem's hand was in this story from the beginning. And so therefore, if you read the Megillah backwards, you are not yotze. In addition to that point, there is a Hasidic interpretation of Hakriyas HaMegillah L'Mafreya, which I believe is from the Baal Shem Tov, that if a person thinks the story of Purim is a story of the past, L'Mafreya, it's a story in the past, Lo Yatze, you missed the whole point of Purim. You have to feel that the story of Purim is repeating itself. We're living with it even today. If you think it's a story of our history, but it's not applicable to you, then you got it all wrong. L'Mafreya, you think it's L'Mafreya, Lo Yatze, you didn't fulfill your obligation of understanding the story of Purim because it's very practical. Kara al peh, kara targum. What happens if you read it by heart, or you read the Targum, which generally means, it literally means a translation, but it means into Aramaic. So you read it Targum, and then it says B'chol Lashon, or you read it in any language. So the Mishnah says Lo Yatze, you did not fulfill your obligation. You have to read it. Sounds like you have to read it in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, not in any other language. It also says you can't read it by heart. You have to actually read it from a parchment. So you can't read it by heart. Al peh is not okay. In Targum, all the language is not okay. However, now the Mishnah
Am I frozen or is it?
The Mishnah seems to contradict itself. The Mishnah now says, well, we just said you can't read it in any language. You're not yotze, you don't fulfill your obligation. And now it says, but you can read it to people who speak other languages. You can read it bilaz in their other language, which basically any language that's not Lashon HaKodesh, Rashi tells us is called laz. And Rashi also mentions this is a contradiction that the Gemara is going to have to deal with, that initially the Mishnah said you can't read it in any language. Now it says you can read it in other languages. Now, you can read it to those people who speak that language in their language. V'haloyes sheshama ashuris, and a loyes, a person who knows other languages that heard it in Hebrew, Ashuris is generally the term used for the Lashon HaKodesh that we call Hebrew. That is called Ashuris, the way it's written. That's the way it's written in the Torah and the Megillah. It's called Ashuris, Ksav Ashuris. There is another Hebrewic language called Ivris, which was generally used for secular. They didn't want to use Ashuris for secular things, so they used another script. But Ashuris is basically another term for Hebrew, and it's with regard to the script, it's the script that we have in a Sefer Torah, that type of right letter. So Loyes that heard it in Ashuris, Yatza, he fulfills his obligation. Now, the point of this statement, you have to hear it in Hebrew, and if you're a person who speaks another language and you heard it in Hebrew, you fulfilled your obligation. What does that mean? What that means is that even though you don't understand Hebrew, you fulfill your obligation in Hebrew. If you heard it in, the Mishnah seemed to say that if you speak French and you heard it in French, that would be okay. But if you don't speak French, it's not okay. But if you heard it in Hebrew and you don't understand Hebrew, you don't speak Hebrew and you don't understand Hebrew, but you heard it in Hebrew, that is fine, even lechatchila, even preferably. You're allowed to hear the Megillah in Hebrew, even though you don't speak Hebrew. Now, this would be seemingly surprising to some. What do you mean you're not understanding anything? What am I listening to the Megillah for in Hebrew and I'm fulfilling some obligation? I don't even understand the words. So how am I benefiting from hearing the Megillah? And the point is that the rabbis made an obligation. You have to hear the story of the Megillah. Even though you don't understand the words, we hope you understand the meaning of it. You're listening to it. And Hebrew language is considered a lashon be'etzem. It's a absolute language. And so you heard the words of the story. What do I mean to say? What I mean to say is that every language in the world, it's not an etzem language. It's not a real language. It's only a agreeable terms that people will be able now to understand something. So let's agree on a certain term. We'll call this a table. That's in front of me holding my sefer. It's called a table. We'll call it a table. And now you know what I'm referring to when I say the word table. But if you think about the actual wood that this table is, it's not connected to the term table. It's not intrinsically connected to the word table. Table is a term that you understand when I'm referring to it, and I understand when you're referring to it because we agreed on it. That's all languages. Hebrew is different. Hebrew, the table, the word shulchan is intrinsically connected to the actual table that my Gemara is on. Why? Because there's energy from each of those letters of the word shulchan that actually makes up the ingredients that are inside a table. So that's what gives energy to this table. The life existence of the table has a soul. The soul is those letters in Hebrew. So Hebrew is a real language. So even though you don't understand Hebrew, you are fulfilling the mitzvah. And did you hear the story of Purim? You heard the story of Purim. Do you understand it? No. But you heard the story. It was a story said, and you heard it. You heard the story of Purim. It was not a mumble jumble. But if you don't understand the word table, and you say the word table to someone who speaks French, he doesn't know what the word table means. That's not going to have any meaning at all, and that person would not be Yitzchok. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to know, does it mean that Adam, when he named everything in the world, did he name it in Ashurit?
Yeah, that's the whole thing, that he was
Okay,
able
that's
to
what I
see.
wanted to know.
Yeah, he
okay.
was able to see that is the energy
Right.
from that Hashem gave him the knowledge that's the energy inside the
Right.
inside each thing. Okay, so now I will current. We're now at the next sentence. Kara siroigin. Kara siroigin means you read it with interruptions, and umisnamne, or you read it when you were partially sleeping. You're falling asleep. You're in and out. you're dozing off. So Yatsa, you did fulfill the mitzvah,
Well,
even though you had small interruptions, which of course the Gemara is going to have to explain. The Mishnah is more of a general, it gives us the general rules. The Gemara, of course, will explain. But if you read it in this way, you did fulfill the mitzvah. Hayakaisva darsha umagia. What happens if you're writing the Megillah? You're writing the Megillah. You're darshaning. You're darsha. You're explaining the Megillah. And while you're explaining it, you're saying the words. So let's say someone's giving a shir on Megillah Esther. So he's saying the words, and he says this means this, and that means that, and he says, well, this really, this is a little insight into this. So he's darshaning it, but he actually said the words of the whole Megillah. Umagia. What happens if he's correcting it? He's looking it over to make sure that the Megillah was written properly. So all of these things, you actually said the words of the Megillah when you did this. You were darshaning it, and you said the words of the Megillah. Actually, I'd have to look into this about how you were darshaning. Did you say the entire Megillah without any word interruption? Or if you speak in the middle, I guess maybe your yaitza, if it's connected to it, maybe that would be a reason why it's not considered a hefsek. We'll have to see in the Gemara. I'm sure maybe some of you remember it from the Gemara, what the law is if you speak in the middle. Does that ruin anything? Probably not. Probably, especially if it's connected to the meaning of the Megillah. But anyway, so here you were darshaning it. You were either writing it, you're darshaning it, or being magia it. And the law is that if you fulfilled your, if you had in mind to be yotzim kiven liba, if you had in mind that while I'm saying these words, I want to fulfill the obligation. So yotze, he's fulfilled his obligation. Vimlav, not. So he said it, but he didn't have in mind that he's fulfilling his obligation. Lo yotze, he's not yotze. Now this is a very famous argument among the commentaries, and it's an argument in the Gemara, really. If mitzvah is tzrichos kavana, the mitzvahs need kavana, intention. Now, what would you say from this Mishnah? Does anyone have any proof from this Mishnah? If you had kavana to be fulfilling the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, obviously you're yaitza. But what happens if you didn't have kavana of fulfilling the Megillah? Do you need kavana? Let's say I read the Megillah from a beautiful Megillah, but I didn't have in mind to fulfill it. I sort of like woke up early Purim morning, and I read the Megillah. I read through it, and then I realized afterwards, I guess maybe I don't have to hear it in shul. I just read it. I just read it in this beautiful Megillah. Do I need to hear it again in shul? Maybe I could leave early.
I think that hogeh and haga'ah is the same as kiven. Haga'ah means thinking into it.
No. That's not what the word Hagah means here. Hagah means you have a Megillah, the scribe just wrote. He says, Rabbi, look it over for me. That's Magia. It's called a Magia. There are scribes. There are special scribes that look it over. They don't even write stuff themselves. They Magia them. And the mezuzahs, you have the same thing. A lot of scribes, they write the Megillah, the mezuzah real fast, and they give it over to a Magia to check. So the Magia is the one who actually checks it. So
it's not Haga'ah.
So that's what Hagah means. It's called the Magia who checks over the. So this is the question here. What do you see from our Mishnah? Does mitzvahs need kavana or do they not need kavana? Did I fulfill my obligation when I woke up early and I read the Megillah? I woke up early on Purim morning. I read through the Megillah, and now I go to shul. I'm like, maybe I was yaitza. Was I yaitza or not? Did I fulfill my obligation, or did I have to listen to it again? What do you think? So the Mishnah says that I basically said the Megillah, Magia or Dorish or Kaisva. All of these cases, you basically said the Megillah, you read the Megillah. But if you had in mind, Kiven Liboy, you fulfilled your obligation. You had in mind that you're fulfilling the mitzvah, you're yaitza, you fulfilled the obligation. And Lav, if not, La Yatza, you didn't fulfill your obligation. So what is that? Excuse me. So what does this say? Do you need kavana for a mitzvah? Now, it sounds like you need kavana. The problem is we have to make this work according to all opinions. So the way to explain it is, thank you, Mordechai. Mordechai just corrected me. The word table in French is actually table. I gave a bad example. Okay, but if table means
le table is in French.
In French. Okay. Anyway, sorry for that example. I have to figure out a better example next time. So the way to explain the Mishnah, again, what you're doing now, we want the Mishnah to fit with all opinions. So the way to explain the Mishnah, even if you hold mitzvahs, they don't need kavana, but it could be that we're nervous here that you didn't say every single word. I'll give you an example. You're being magia the Megillah. Okay, so you have a Megillah in front of you that's kosher. You have a Megillah that the scribe gave you. Or you're writing Megillah. You have a Megillah in front of you that's kosher. You have a Megillah that you're in the middle of writing. So you're looking up at all the words, and you look down, you write it. So Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh. Okay, Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh. You're saying each word. If you had in mind to specifically say every single word, then you're yaitze. But I might have had in mind what I'm doing. I might not have had that in mind, that I'm going to have to say every word. Certain words, I know I have to write. It's so famous. So I didn't specifically have in mind. Like I know, I know that pasuk so well. I say it every day in La Yehudim Haisa Eira. I say it in Abdullah, right? I say it so often. I'm not that I wasn't so careful to say maybe. So I wasn't so, it's because certain psukim that are so popular, so famous. I don't need to. Maybe I didn't have that in mind to say every single word. So generally, I said every word, and I was writing the Megillah. I was saying the words that I was reading and making sure not to forget a word when I was writing. But I might have not had in mind. I didn't have in mind to say every single word. So if I didn't have that extra intent to say every word, I'm not yaitze because we're afraid I missed out some words. But kavana to fulfill the mitzvah, that I don't need. So in other words, there's different ways of learning this Mishnah. You could say im kiven Levi to say the words. What is kiven Levi? I had intent. Intent for what? So the simple reading is you had intent to fulfill the mitzvah. But the other reading is I had intent to say the words. Now, I will also tell you that something that you probably know. There's a difference between the night Megillah reading and the day Megillah reading. Is any of you familiar with that? The night Megillah reading is definitely rabbinic. The day Megillah reading is called divrei Kabbalah. It's words of receiving. It's like a nevuah type of level. It's not considered rabbinic. So it has more, it has more of a, similar to a biblical status. In other words, generally something that's rabbinic, we're more lenient with. Something that's biblical, we're more strict with. So I will tell you that the reading of the Megillah by day is called divrei Kabbalah. That's like a biblical, it has a status almost like a biblical obligation because it's from the words of the prophets. And the reading at night is called rabbinic. So there's more leniency at the night Megillah reading than by the day Megillah reading. And that concept could be applicable here because even the opinion that says that you need kavana to fulfill a mitzvah, that could be only by a biblical obligation. That would be by the day mitzvah you need to have in mind, but not by the night mitzvah. So it could be a difference between the mitzvah by day and the mitzvah at night. There is such a concept of that by mitzvahs drabanan, you don't need to fulfill the obligation. You don't need to have in mind to fulfill the obligation. So again, we just spoke about kavana now. This is the second paragraph of the Mishnah where it talks about reading it while you're doing something else. So you weren't necessarily having in mind to read every word, or you weren't necessarily having in mind to fulfill the mitzvah. You were just reading it for a different reason. You had another reason why you were reading it. You were Megillah, you were fixing. Now, let me ask you a question. If you're writing a Megillah, how could you fulfill your obligation?
Because you go word by word.
Yeah, but you don't have the whole Megillah. Yet it's not a kosher Megillah.
It's going to be you are advancing.
After you finished,
you're
you read it.
advancing with it.
How does that
But
work?
anyhow,
It's not kosher now.
Megillah is proofreading.
So Megillah is not a problem.
Yeah.
Because Megillah, it's all written.
But you're reading it. You're reading it from something else in order to be able to write it.
Yes, thank you, Ezra. So I sort of answered the question a little earlier. Just want you basically have a kosher Megillah in front of you, and you're looking at that one and writing it down onto the new one. So which one are you really fulfilling your obligation with? The one that you're looking at, and not the one you're writing. But you're anyway. The bottom line is, the Mishnah says, "Kiven liba," you fulfilled your obligation. Like kiven liba lo yatsa. However, you translate that, you did not fulfill your obligation. If you were like kiven liba, either it means kavana, intent to fulfill the mitzvah, or it means kavana, to read every word. But I will also mention that there is a interesting opinion that says that even though mitzvahs don't need kavana, even according to that view, Megillah needs kavana. You normally don't need intent to fulfill a mitzvah. You ate matzah and you didn't have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. You didn't have in mind when you did all these things. You did mitzvahs. You didn't have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah. No problem. But Megillah, you need to have kavana. Why? Because Megillah is all about publicizing the miracle. And because of that, it carries with it a bigger importance to know what you are doing so that you are publicizing the miracle properly. So, and by reading it properly and not reading it just without having any intent, that's what is more of a publicity to the miracle, especially to yourself. You're publicizing it to yourself. You're fulfilling this mitzvah of reading the Megillah rather than just reading it, and you're not publicizing the miracle. So there is such a vart that Megillah needs tiv kavana. Even if all the other mitzvahs don't, Megillah might be unique. Okay, next case of the Mishnah. These are all different types of ink. So you wrote the Megillah with all these different types of ink. Al haniyar, on paper, al hadiftara, and on diftara. Diftara, the Gemara is going to explain what it means. It means something that it's parchment that wasn't fully processed. You did the salting to it. You did the flour to it. There's flour and water that they mix, that they put on, but you didn't do the final stage of making it into parchment, into cloth, and therefore law yatsa, it says you did not fulfill your obligation. It has to be written in a proper Megillah with the proper parchment and the proper ink. Acha take suva ashuras, has to be written in Hebrew, and now it has to be written in Hebrew, Ashuris. Now, some say that this only applies if you're writing Hebrew words, you have to use the Hebrew alphabet. But if you're writing English words, there is such a view that maybe you don't need to have the Hebrew letters. You could use English letters for English or whatever other language is going to be Yotze, which we'll have to deal with later. But if could be that the Ashuris is not necessarily an absolute rule for other languages. It could be there is such a view. I'm not.
Transliteration would work.
Yeah, transliteration would be the term. But anyway, the Mishnah says you need Ashuris, which it sounds like even for other languages, you need to use Hebrew letters but you could do it transliterated into other languages according to that other view according to that other statement there this other statement that you could fulfill the obligation with other languages. Okay, but you needed ashuras, you needed al hasefer, which means klaf, uvediyai, and you need to use the proper ink, not this sam sikra kumas and kankantum, which maybe we will see what they mean, unless someone with the art scroll wants to translate those words that are different types of inks. Obviously, it's probably not common knowledge. One of them is probably gallnut juice or something. I don't know. Humus concantum, vitriol. I don't know what they are. Sikra is sikra is a red. Sikra, I think, is a red ink. That's it. Sam. Anyone have art? Does the art scroll translate them, or they don't even translate those words? Okay. Yes. Do we have anyone listening here?
Yeah, I'm listening. I can't find any direct reference to what they mean by the different inks.
In other words, the art scroll doesn't translate it?
No, not that I can find.
The place where we're holding is we are basically the last part of the Mishnah, right before Gemara.
Yeah. No, the last paragraph. I got it.
You got it, but it doesn't translate.
But no. There's again, they have them in their vernacular, but it doesn't say what it is. It doesn't describe it. Let me look and see. Hold on.
Steinsaltz says it's not ink and it's paper, so it's not.
No, that. Yeah, no, you're talking about niyar. What about the line before it?
Well, it says
I think is red, but yeah.
It says all these terms are defined in the Gemara below at 18b, 19a.
Right.
Let me look.
Okay, so we'll see it. No, okay, fine. Well, when we get to it, I guess we'll see it. That's fine. If it doesn't translate, it means we're not supposed to know it yet. That's fine. Okay, the Gemara. Now we're going to start the Gemara. Okay, Menohani Nili. How do we know all these things that Megillah, that it says in the Mishnah, you can't read it backwards? How do we know you fulfilled your obligation if or you don't fulfill your obligation if you read it backwards? How do you know that? Amar Rava says, Damar Rava, because it says in the pasuk in Megillah Esther, Tichsavam b'chizmanom. It says like it's written and like its time, its era, its time period, where it's so the Jewish people were full. It says that Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim aleihem bi'alzaram. The Jewish people accepted on them and on their children, Balkol anilvim aleihem, and all those that come along with them, that v'lo yavar, that it shouldn't pass the 2 days, kirsavam b'chizmanam b'chol shana v'shana, that like it's written and like it's time every single year. They accepted basically to fulfill these obligations, these mitzvahs of Purim, this celebration of Purim. So it says kirsavam b'chizmanam. The Gemara is going to compare these two. Mazmanam lemafrei aloi, just like the time. You can't go back. It's impossible that the time later can be before. So af ksavam lemafrei aloi. So in other words, the reason why he uses these terms is to tell you that you have to compare ksav to zman, just like zman in time. You can't say that I'm going to have Wednesday before Tuesday. So also in the writing, I can't have the writing of a later verse before the verse that's earlier. Now the Gemara asks, "Midi kriya ksiva hacha?" Are we talking about reading here? Asiya ksiva. It's talking about doing these mitzvahs. The chsiv, as it says, li yois oisim es shnei hayamim, to do these mitzvahs. It's not talking about reading. So you're bringing a source about not doing something later. That is not something that's supposed to be later. You can't do it before. That has to do with action, because that's what the psukim are talking about, and it doesn't say anything about reading the Megillah. Maybe reading the Megillah could be done and not in exactly the right order. And since it uses the word asiya, that's how the Gemara says this doesn't prove anything from comparing ksav and zman. Now,
who would want to read it backwards? Maybe it's dyslexic or something.
Well, I guess the Gemara's question really is if someone did that, he skipped a verse, and now the question is, do you have to go all the way back to that verse, or could I just fill it in now? Because that would be a very practical example. Either you skipped a verse or you skipped a word, and now you didn't fulfill that whole verse because you missed a word in the verse. So can you just listen to that verse later on? It's actually very practical because very often the person who reads the Megillah, he reads it fast and he swallows certain words, and sometimes you don't even hear a whole word. And if you miss a whole word, then you got to go back. Now, what happens if that's at the end of the Megillah? If it's at the end of the Megillah, guess what? You have no problem. You just have him reread for you the last three verses or something, and you have no problem because you're reading it in order now. You missed a word 3 verses before the end. So go to the guy who read it and say, could you just read for me the last 3 verses? And now you heard the whole Megillah until the last 3 verses, and you missed the word. Now you'll hear the last 3 words. But if you missed a word in the beginning of the Megillah, you either have to go all the way back to the beginning, he's got to read the whole Megillah again, or maybe you could fulfill it by just hearing that one verse. It won't be in order. So the Mishnah tells you that you cannot do that.
Yeah, listen,
yes, Robert.
In referral to the comment about reading it backwards, what we have written in the art scroll doesn't say backwards. It only says reading it out of sequence. So again, what your explanation is that you miss points and whatever, but there's no definitive, writing that it's done backwards. That's
right.
All.
Okay. That there are 3 examples of backwards. I used the word backwards. But you're right. I shouldn't have used it. One is backwards, like I said it. The other is like you're saying, Robert, that you missed a verse, and the other is you missed a whole paragraph.
Right. It's out of sequence.
All of those are out of sequence. So that would be
out
a better translation. Thank you. Okay.
Right. It's done haphazardly, essentially.
Now I just want to clarify the pasuk said ksava. Ksava means the written story or the written item, which refers to the Megillah. So the Megillah is similar to Zman. That's what the Gemara understood. The problem is that in the verse that it says ksavam, talks about the Megillah, it uses the word that we're supposed to do these things, ksavam, like there's ksavam and like there's manam, like the Megillah and like the time. So the way the Gemara understands it is if it's talking about doing, it's not specifically referring to this law is not specifically referring to the reading of the Megillah. It's referring to the actions that are written in the Megillah, which are the mitzvahs of Shalach Manas, Mishta, and Simcha, Matanis Lav Yoinim. So it's not necessarily applicable to the actual reading. And that's what the Gemara is saying, that we can't really prove from here that it has to be in order. So Ella Mehacha, so the Gemara says, no, we're going to learn it from a different verse. The Chsivad says, Vayom Elan Iskar these days are mentioned, are remembered in dawn. Iskish Zchira La Asiya. So we compare the remembering, which means the reading the Megillah, to the doing. Ma'asiya La Mafreya Loi. Just like the doing, you can't do them out of order. In other words, you're making a holiday and you have the 14th day and the 15th day. So you can't do the 15th before the 14th. So Av Zechira Lamafreya Loi, also Zechira, the remembering cannot be done Lamafreya. You can't do backwards the reading, or not backwards, out of sequence, the reading. Just like the 15th can't be before the 14th, so the reading cannot be out of sequence. Tana, we learned in a brisa of Chen Bahalo, the same thing applies to Hallel. Now, V'chein b'kriyas Shema, the same thing applies to kriyas Shema. Uvet tefillah, and the same thing applies to davening. They all have to be said in their right order. And tefillah is Shemona Esrei. That all of these things have to be said in the right order. Now, there was a discussion I should mention about the davening, Shemona Esrei, because what does that refer to? If you do the Shemona Esrei out of order, what happens if you skipped a paragraph in the middle of Shemona Esrei? So you skipped, there's like 13 different paragraphs in the middle of the Shemona Esrei, and so it's possible to like skip one and go to the next one, and then you want to know, what should I do? Should I go back to the one I skipped and make it up, and then jump ahead, or should I start all over from the place where I skipped one? Let's say I forgot to say the blessing about tshuva. Slach lanu achzreinu. Slach lanu, let's say slach lanu. I forgot to do slach lanu. So should I go back? Slach lanu is the third atachreinu ladam das, and then you have hashivenu avinu hashivenu slach lanu. Yeah, and then you have slach lanu. So you want to know if I skipped slach lanu. So I'm all the way by Shema Kuleinu already. Should I go back to Slach Lanu and just say it, and then go back to Shema Kuleinu where I'm up to, or do I have to do everything in order? So this statement, Tana, we learned in a brisa. The same thing applies to Hallel. Same thing applies to Kriya Shema. Same thing applies to Tefillah. That you have to do these things in order. They have to be in order. That if you missed, you have to go back to Slach Lanu and start from there and do all of the brachas in that order. That's the way the Chachamim establish it. And that's the halacha. There is another view that says that this law applies only in the first three and the last three brachas of Shemona Esrei, that it has to be in order. But that view is not accepted in halacha. The accepted halacha is that all of the middle blessings also have to be in order. There's a special order to the brachas. And if you do it out of order, you messed it up. You got to start all over from where you messed up. Okay, and now the Gemara says, how do we know Hallel has to be in order? Hallel Manola and Rabbah. Rabbah says the Chsiv, because it says Mizrach Shemesh, from the east sun ad Mavoya until it sets. So it rises in the east, it sets in the west. So you have to praise Hashem, Mizrach Shemesh ad Mavoya, until it sets in the west. Buhulal Shem Hashem, God's name is praised. That's the verse. So what do we see from there? That just like the sun has to rise in the east, and it doesn't switch it doesn't switch order with when it sets. So the same thing is Hashem's praise, which refers to Hallel, that you can't switch the order. And Rabbi Yosef Amar Yosef says, how do we know by Hallel that it has to be in order? It says this, that this is the Zehayim, Zehayim, that just like this is the day that Hashem did this for me, Nagila v'nisb'chabay, right? You're gonna rejoice in it. So the just like the Yom does not change. You can't have a later hour come before an earlier hour. So also the Hallel has to be in sequence. Now, Rav Abya says, Yishem Hashem Avayrach. The name of Hashem should be blessed, and that's referring to the Hallel, that it should be Yehi, just like it's the way it is. Let it be. That it should, the word Yehi should be the way it is. In the way Yehi, it should be like that's the way it should be. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok v'Tem Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Amar Mehacha Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok and Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says from another pasuk Me'ata v'Yad Olam, from now and forever. You can't go backwards. It can't be the opposite. It's impossible for time to go from the forever then to now. So time goes from now until the other end. So the same thing is the Hallel has to be, it says Me'ata v'Yad Olam, to that pasuk. So it's from the end of the pasuk me'ata ve'adolam that it shows you have to be in order. Now, what does this mean practically? So practically, this refers to even the days that you skip Hallel, you have to do Hallel in order. You can't switch around the verses and do it out of sequence. It has to be in order. You have to use that right order that we have in the Siddur, even the times that we skip some of the paragraphs, but in order it has to be. Now, the Gemara now jumps to Kriyashma, 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 Kirsava. So the Gemara says the din of Kriyashma, the Tanya, because we learned in a Brisa, Kriyashma Kirsava. We're on the bottom line of the Gemara. I'm going to start again from the beginning of the bottom line. Kriyashma, the law of Kriyashma, that it cannot be done out of sequence. The Tanya, because we're in the Brisa, Kriyashma Kirsava, Kriyashma is the way it's read. Divrei Rebbe, these are the words of Rebbe, the way it's written, excuse me, Kirsava, the way it's written, and which refers here to that it has to be in Hebrew and not in another language. So Kriyashma has to be in Hebrew and not in another language, because it says, Rebbe says it has to be Kirsava, the way it's written in the Torah. The way it's written in the Torah is in Hebrew, so that's how it has to be read. The rabbis say in any language, my taima the Rebbe, the two letters, mem tes is my taima. What is the reason of Rebbe? Why does Rebbe say it has to be in Hebrew? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, V'hayu. Now we turn the page to 17b. We just turned the page. We're on 17b. V'hayu, Vav Yasan Yehu. Now, we started off saying that there's an argument, Rebbe and the rabbis, if Kriyash must be in Hebrew or in other languages. The reason why this is being brought here is really to emphasize the law about reading it out of sequence, but we're not up to that yet. Now we're going to get up to that right now. First, we mentioned about the issue of reading it in different languages, and now based on how we learn that, we're going to be able to see that there's going to be a source for having Shema read out of sequence. So that's where we're up to. We're now on 17b. V'hayu bav yasan yehu. It says, V'hayu, these words should be on your heart. V'hayu, we translate, they should be the way they are, which means they have to be the way they're written in the Torah in Hebrew. In the Rabbanan, my time mayu. So the rabbis, what is their reason that you're allowed to say the Shema in any language? My time mayu, what is their reason? Amar Kra, because it says Shema b'chol lashon shatu Shema. It says Shema, listen or hear. Hear any language that you can understand. That's good enough. But Rebbe Nami Yoksiv Shema. Rebbe also, it says Shema. So from the word Shema, we can learn that it's it sounds like any language. Rebbe said, no. Shema is telling you that you have to hear with your ears what you are saying. A person should say the Shema loud enough that he could hear himself what he's saying. Now, that's what the word Shema is telling you. And therefore, he does not learn that you could say Shema in any language. He learns that Shema is teaching you that you have to hear it with your ears. Now the Gemara says, Rabbanan, so what do the rabbis do? What do the rabbis do with this law? How do they know such a law? Because they use the word Shema to teach you that any language that you understand is good enough. That's how they learn out of Shema. So how do they know that you have to hear it with your ears? The rabbis say, Rabbanan Savri, Rabbanan, what do the rabbis do? Savri, they hold, Commando Amar, that even if a person doesn't hear the Shema, as long as he says it quietly, he's Yaitzer. He fulfills his obligation. And therefore, they don't learn from the word Shema that you have to hear it. They learn from the word Shema that you can say Shema in any language. So Rabbana nami haksiv v'hayu. Now, what do the rabbis do with Rebbe's source? Rebbe's source was it says v'hayu. It has to be the way it is, the way it's in the Torah, is in Hebrew. How could you say the Shema in any language? So the rabbis say, no, v'hayu doesn't come for that. V'hayu comes for a different teaching. The word v'hayu, again, we're taking every single word of the Torah and we are trying to learn, deduce from those words, the fact that the Torah picks certain words, it's telling us something specific about the laws of Shema. That what is it telling us? So the rabbis say the word v'hayu is not teaching you that it has to be Hebrew, the way it's written in Hebrew. That's how you have to say the Shema. This is the reason why we brought this whole thing, for this statement, that the rabbis learned from the word v'hayu that you're not allowed to read it out of sequence. It has to be the way it's written in the Torah, not the Hebrew part. The fact that it's in this order in the Torah that you can't do in a different order out of sequence. You can't read it. So this is the source of what we said, in the Brisa, that Kriya Shema also has rules about reading in order. Now, I should mention, there's something important to be mentioned here, that Kriya Shema has some unique law. Am I allowed to say V'haya im Shamaya, the second paragraph of Shema, before the first? Or the third paragraph before the second? So we're saying now that you can't read Shema out of order. The rabbis learn it from the word V'hayu, it has to be in order. Now, I translated Lemafreya backwards, right? That's the way I was translating it, or out of sequence. But again, there's three situations that out of sequence could be. It could be in every single word I'm reading backwards. So I read the last word, then the second to last word. There's 245 words of the Shema. We add 3, make it 248, like the limbs of a person. But it's basically 245 words of the Shema. So if you read it backwards, you read word 248, then word 247, 246, 245. You read those words, Emes, Elokeichem, Hashem, Ani, you read backwards. So that was one way of Lemafreya. Another way of Lemafreya is you read a verse out of sequence. But then you have the third way of Lemafreya, reading a paragraph out of sequence. Now, think about it. How are the paragraphs written in the Torah? Which paragraph is first in the Torah of Shema? Where is the paragraph Shema b'Ahavta? V'aschanon. Where is the paragraph V'hayam Shemaya? Second paragraph of Shema. Where is it in the Torah? It's in Akev. So that's the right sequence, right? First you have Shema, then you have V'hayam Shemaya is the next parsha. V'aschanon Akev. Where is Vayomer? Shlach. Thank you, Yisrael. Vayomer is in Shlach. Is Shlach after V'aschanon and Akev, or is it before? It's way before. It's in the fourth book of Moses. V'aschanon and Akev is in the fifth book of Moses, in Devarim, right? So Shlach is in Bamidbar. It's way before. So in the Torah, it's written out of order. The paragraphs are written out of order. So for Shema, you don't have to do the paragraphs in order. You have to do the verses in order. You can't do the verses out of sequence. You can't do the words out of sequence. But the paragraphs you could do out of sequence, by the way. So I'm just sharing that there is a little difference between the Shema ruling of Lemafreya, going out of sequence, and the other cases, Hallel and the Megillah, these things that are out of sequence, Tefillah, these you can't do the paragraphs out of. But Shema, you can do the paragraphs out of. You're not supposed to L'chatchila, but if you did it,
you can say the second paragraph first.
So
you have to start with the word Shema.
Well, if you did it out of sequence, you fulfilled your obligation.
If you didn't say Shema first, you said the second.
That's what it sounds like. Now, the only maybe you have to say Shema and then you skip V'ahavta to the. But
Yeah.
I don't think so. No, I think it's Shema. Yeah, I think the first way I said it is correct. That if you said V'ahav V'haya and then you said Shema afterwards, then I think that's what it's referring to. I'll tell you why. Because Shema is right before V'ahavta, and it's one paragraph. If you do Shema, then you do. Oh no, I don't know if it's a problem. One second. If you said Shema, then you did V'haya im Shemaya. Yeah, maybe it is a problem. Because now what you're doing is you're doing the verses. Well, maybe not. Yeah, you're not really doing the verses out of sequence because you said Shema first, then you did V'haya im Shemaya, and then you're doing V'ahavta. So I guess your verses are pretty much in sequence. Except that the second paragraph is you did before the first. But my understanding is, again, we can look it up in Shulchan Aruch, but it is brought in Shulchan Aruch that if a person changed the order of the paragraphs, he fulfilled his obligation, and it's brought in Rambam that way. It's brought in Shulchan Aruch. I don't know in the actual Shulchan Aruch, but in the commentaries there, it's brought in. I have to look it up in the laws of Shema. The laws of Shema, if you exactly what it refers to. But if you did them out of sequence, and the simple example would be you said Vayomer before V'haya im Shemaya, you fulfilled your obligation. You don't have to say Shema again because you did the verses in order, and that's all that's needed. Because even in the Torah, the paragraphs of Shema are out of sequence, are in a different sequence. Okay. Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
Excuse me, but I have a couple of points for your clarification. The first is that V'ahavta comes before V'haya because aside from the issue of the sequence in the Torah, that
you're supposed to accept
the first paragraph.
Accept Hashem before the mitzvahs. Accept the yoke of heaven before the mitzvahs.
Right. Yeah,
so that's a good question. But the answer is that's the reason the rabbis wanted it that way. But it doesn't. We don't have a source that if you did it in the opposite order, you didn't fulfill your obligation. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. In other words, you're right. Preferably, you're not allowed to do this. You can't go around switching the. Don't go up there in the shul and be the chazan and then say, oh, Vayomer, I'll do Vayomer first, and then I'll do V'haya. I'm going to show them that I know the halal. I can do it this way, And then everyone's looking at you like, wow, what is he doing? Switching the order? No, Shulchan Aruch, Rambam. This is this, right? You're not allowed to do that. If you did it, you fulfilled your obligation, but you're not allowed to do this out of order. And maybe because Yisrael's reason, the rabbis had a specific reason why it should be in this order. And so you're preferably not allowed to change the order that the rabbis established. But if you did it, you're yaitza. You did fulfill your obligation.
Another point, Rabbi, to me, I understood that the last paragraph was added to the overall performance of Shema as a convenience to help people fulfill the mitzvah of Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim.
Say that one more about, did you say Hallel?
No, I'm saying the last paragraph in Shema.
Oh, okay? Shema. Yeah.
Okay, so that paragraph really is not logically connected to the first two paragraphs to begin with, and it was just placed in there as a convenience so that people would not forget their obligation to say Zecher L'Tzias Mitzrayim.
Good point. Some commentaries use that as a reason. I mentioned the reason why Shema is different is because in the Torah itself, it's not in this order. But some commentaries bring that point that you just said. So very well said, that Shema, the first paragraph of Shema, doesn't necessarily lead into they're two entities of their own. First paragraph, the second paragraph, of course, they're connected, but they're entities of their own. In the third paragraph, especially what Yisrael just said, they're entities of their own. And however, the Megillah, it's a long story. You have to do it in order, It has to be. You can't do a chapter that's later, paragraph that's later to do it out of sequence. But the Shema could be out of order because the meaning of it, the entity of they have entity, they have an element of being an entity of their own in and of itself, and therefore it's not a problem. Hallel is different. Hallel is also like an order. It has to be there's an order to the Hallel. It has a whole sequence of how it's meant to lead from one into the other, and Yitzias Mitzrayim, and it ultimately goes to Yemais HaMashiach, Gog Magog, right? There's a loss of Levi, so Tchias HaMesim. There's a concept. There are hints to at least the way the order of Hallel, and therefore it has to be in order. But Shema would be different, and therefore, so that what you're saying is correct. Thank you, Yisrael, for adding that because it is mentioned in the among other commentaries. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say, but we know that in the Torah there is no mukdam u'meuchar. Sometimes things come before something that didn't happen yet, or whatever,
right.
Or did happen before.
Right. The that's an interesting point. So you want to say maybe that's the source.
The timeline doesn't really fit sometimes.
Maybe that's the source. Interesting. No, I didn't see any of the commentaries mention that because of Ein, you want to say that because there's a rule that there's no order to the Torah, therefore we should allow if you did the paragraphs out of order, it's not a problem because Ein Mukdam Muqar B'Torah, therefore Megillah is different. It's not
different. Megillah,
and Hallel is Tillim, and Shemoneh Esrei is the rabbinic institution, but the Shema is so that's an interesting point. Again, I have to look up and see if maybe any commentary mentions. Nice, good thinking. Okay, Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
You too, Rabbi.
Okay.
Sei gesund.